today we're going to talk about, I think, something that I wish was talked about a little bit more when I went to camp and stuff, and I think that it's just kind of overlooked, which is how is a debate being evaluated? We do have a lot of common vocabulary and systems for analyzing various things in debate, but it's oftentimes that not all of that, I think, is told to you in one setting and kind of walk through. So the goal of this lecture is for us to understand how debates are being evaluated and what you can do to ensure that debates are more often than not decided in your favor. So starting at kind of a high level, policy debates are plan focused, right? So that means that the judge is evaluating the unique consequences of adopting the plan. That's just a way of saying that the judge is comparing worlds where the plan does and doesn't happening and is trying to determine which is better or worse, right? So the variable there is the advocacy of change, right? And that change is the government's doing a policy, right? So the judge is considering various competing worlds. The world of the status quo, that being which no policy or change is implemented, the world of the plan, when the plan is done, and if the neg has introduced counter plans, the world of those various counterplans. To evaluate those competing worlds, and most things generally in debate, no matter your method of evaluation, right? We're considering offense and defense. And in this case, that's simply reasons why one world is comparatively worse than another, right? So the affirmative, right, is introducing advantages, right, to demonstrate why the world of the plan is preferable to the status quo. The negative is typically introducing disadvantages to say that the world of the status quo is comparatively better than the plan. And offensive arguments in debate, right, need uniqueness, right? So you can't simply say, when you're the neg, the AF worsens a problem that already exists, right? You need to say that issue, you need to introduce a uniqueness claim that is either descriptive or predictive that says that that's fine and that the plan actively makes that worse, right? When introducing advantages in DAs, right, they are organized as internal link chains. So advantages in DAs are a set of causal claims stemming from the uniqueness argument and ultimately reaching an impact that's considered important. In the modern day of debate, that means it kills a lot of people. And when you're considering internal link chains, you want to think about their cumulative probability, right? So this means you're not just considering the size of the impact or one part of the internal link chain. Everywhere from the uniqueness through till the impact, right, there is a cumulative risk that is added up to determine the overall probability or likelihood of an advantage or a disadvantage. If you're only mitigating one part of an internal link chain, that makes it more difficult for you to win the debate, right? So for example, if you just introduce impact defense, right, you have conceded the entire top part of the internal link chain, which means essentially now one side just needs to win risk of some impact to win the debate because you've spotted them a lot of their other claims. The other reason this is a problem, if you're only mitigating one part, is that it's easier to exploit other parts of your internal link chain if you have conceded the other side. So take an example, right? If you don't introduce an impact defense or uniqueness argument against an advantage that has a terminal uniqueness claim, right? So say the AF has a claim that war is inevitable for some reason, right? So maybe on this topic that's because the US is losing its innovation edge. If the neg DA has a war impact, right, not having a reason war isn't coming now makes it more difficult for you to win the debate, right? And is likely going to not meet your DA. So you need to be thinking about the entire internal link chain and try to poke holes in multiple areas. And again, every part of the internal link chain also needs uniqueness, right? So the neg, right, reading a DA with a warming impact is typically considered ineffective, right? Because if the neg can read a warming impact, that means that warming is currently being solved in the status quo, right? So having a card that, having an internal link card that says something causes warming or something solves warming is not sufficient, right? You need a uniqueness argument that establishes that warming is being solved now and that the plan uniquely stops whatever status quo efforts solve warming, right? The other thing, right, when you're AF, right, is that you need a reverse causal piece of solvency evidence, right? And that essentially means that the uniqueness argument that you've introduced, right, the status quo trend, is something that is reversed by the plan, right? So it is not sufficient to say simply the absence of the plan will, harm innovation, but you must also have a card that says the presence of the plan being implemented would actively reverse the reason that innovation is low in the status quo. The other thing about internal link change is that risk is often, considered, we think about it in terms of relative risk. We think very few things are yes-no questions and simply have varying scales of probabilities, right? Because generally both sides can introduce evidence for different sets of competing claims, right? And depending on the debating and the evidence quality, right, you can assess what the relative risk of those things are, right? So I think about risk as like an asymptote. So I don't really care about math very much, but like, you remember the asymptote graph that you learned in whatever math class, right? It approaches zero, but it never reaches zero, right? So I would think about risk in that frame, right? It rarely is yes, no, or gets to zero, but most things are approaching zero. There is some uncertainty around them, and your debating should generally attempt to account for uncertainty. Now, there are some instances where it's potentially useful, right, to phrase things in yes, no terms, right? So in instances where evidence or arguments have been introduced that simply don't apply to your internal link chain, it can sometimes be useful to have it be yes, no, right? So if you read advantage with a China war impact, right, and then I read Russia war defense, right, it's more advantageous there for you to just say, hey, we said China war impact, they read Russia defense, instead of actually actively answering all the warrants there, right? But in general, the reason that yes-no phrasing is not great is because if the answer is you get is no, then you are near zeroing whatever claim or argument that you have introduced, right? So I would generally recommend that you phrase things in probabilistic terms, and even in instances where there are yes-no things that are being introduced along the internal link chain, you should offer lots of judge instruction on how to come to a conclusion on whether the answer to that is yes or no, and you should ideally include a secondary set of arguments that accounts for the fact that you could lose this, right? So like an even if argument. But generally though, I think there are still a couple instances where I see that risk can fall to zero or very low. So the first category of that I would say is arguments solved by fiat, right? So generally speaking, if you say the plan will get rolled back or the government won't do the plan, you can simply say fiat solves, and it's rare that that argument is going to get very much risk, right? Republicans won't do the plan is generally not evaluated or considered something that mitigates an internal chain. The second set of arguments where that can get something to zero risk is when you explicitly concede the argument, right? So another side introduces a card or argument, right? And you in one of your speech explicitly concede it. It's generally thought that you have to take that argument to its full implication, right? So if you have a China war impact, right? And the other side concedes no China war, right? In general, that zeroes that internal link chain. Now, that's not always true, right? Because you can still introduce arguments where the full implication isn't to fully reduce the risk of the internal link chain. So, for example, right, if you read disease defense, most disease defense cards don't dispute the fact that diseases kill people. They're merely contesting the claim that disease causes extinction. So conceding disease defense in some instances might not mean that it eliminates the entirety of the impact. Though, of course, some of that is also subject to debating. The kind of last instance that I would consider zero risk or approaching there is when you introduce an internal link chain that is simply missing a part, right? So in those instances, there's still a touch of risk because it's kind of like introducing the argument analytically. But if the other side has pointed out it's missing and has a card, it's very difficult for you to win the debate unless you've completely annihilated, whatever they've said, right? So example here would be like, if you read a bunch of cards saying plan solves innovation, innovation causes extinction, but forgot to introduce a card that says innovation declining now, right? The other side introduces a card that says innovation high now. That makes it very difficult for you to win much of a risk of that internal link chain simply because you did not introduce the relevant part of it for you to help increase its risk. So the typical method that I think we're all taught for comparing internal link chains or considering, advantages and DAs is impact calculus, right? And impact calculus, is very useful for helping compare internal link chains. I think one of the misconceptions around it, though, is that impact calculus means just the impacts are relevant. While the impact is important, right, the thing that the internal link chain ultimately gets to, you also want to impact calculus, you want to call it impact calculus, but you would want to think essentially about probability, magnitude, and time frame for other parts of the internal link chain, right? So, for instance, right, if you're reading an economy disadvantage, right, the magnitude of the link is very important because generally in econ debates, both sides have some inroads to the economy, right? So you want to compare who has a larger internal link to the economy, right? Or maybe one side has an argument that the link is faster than solvency, etc., right? So you want to be thinking about time frame, probability, and magnitude for all parts of the internal link chain when you're comparing an advantage and a DA. Generally speaking, I think probability is the most important. That's because no matter what's happening in the debate, you're assessing the likelihood of things, right? You're trying to come to a judgment about how probable something is. Magnitude and time frame I find to be less useful because most things that are really high magnitude are so far off that they don't matter. And most things that are very, very short time frame have a relatively small magnitude. So I generally think that probability is the best way to be thinking about these things. Though of course the other two standards of impact calculus are also important to be considering. The other issue I think with treating the impact, so the core reason I think people think about the impact is most important is because it's ultimately like, you know, the reason something matters, right? Something causes extinction, tons of people die, the world is in chaos, right? And if you remove that part, the rest of the internal link chain is meaningless. So that's true, but it's also true if you sever any part of an internal link chain, right? So if you don't have a link argument, right, then the internal link chain is also gone, right? Because there's nothing the plan would uniquely cause to result in the harms, right? You know, internal link can also zero you, and similarly, like I mentioned before, if uniqueness is going in the totally wrong direction, you're also in trouble, right? So each part of the internal link chain is important. You know, it's obviously advantageous for you to say certain parts are more important than the others, depending on the quality of your argument and how the debate is going. But in general, you shouldn't, I think, come from the perspective that, oh, the impact is the thing that comes before everything, and it's the only thing that matters before the rest of the internal link chain. But some reason, the real reason, though, that you shouldn't think about the impact that much is because the impact is the last part of the internal link chain, right? So, as I mentioned before, when you're comparing internal link chains, you need to consider the cumulative probability, right, of an advantage or DA, right? So, your impact, you know, being extinction and unmitigated does not mean that you auto-win the debate, right? If somebody is winning a large link and internal link takeout, right, it doesn't matter if you get to extinction if there's a very low probability of the internal link chain getting there in the first place, right? So because you have to win the upper part of the internal link chain to get to the impact, right, it requires, for the impact to matter, right, that upper part needs to be very fast before it becomes relevant and you get to the impact, right? So I think there are a few kind of misconceptions that come up when we're thinking about impacts, right? So the first I would say is there's lots of people that think, oh, if somebody has the same impact as, you know, my advantage or DA, that means I can no longer read this or go for this because we're doing the same thing. Again, this is not the case, right? The internal link chains, right, the causal chain of events stemming from each of the competing worlds that both sides have introduced, right, are still separate from each other, right? So if both, last year, I think one thing that was very common, right, is AF has growth impact, right, and neg also gets to an econ impact, right? Just because both sides have an econ impact does not mean that you can no longer win an econ DA because the AF also has an econ impact, right? Particularly because in most of these instances, both teams have different internal links to the economy, right? So the AF is usually talking about a longer term trend related to economic growth and why slowing growth over the long term increases the propensity for war, right? And the negative is talking about a much more short term shock to the economy, right? So like a rate hike or something in the short term that will cause a fast, quick economic decline, a recession, right? And that will result in war, right? So having the same impact does not necessarily mean that something immediately becomes irrelevant because one side has inroads to the same impact, because in most instances the internal link chains are completely separate, right? So that's also a reason why you shouldn't worry too much about, oh, do we have an external impact, right? Because if you win a fast, large internal link to your one impact, even if the other side has that impact, if you have successfully mitigated other parts of the internal link chain, and one that your internal link to that impact is more important, right, you are more likely to win the debate. The other issue I think that comes up with external impacts is that they're often attached to like the same internal link that was being discussed, right? So it's like, if you have an econ DA and then you read a card that says, growth solves disease, disease causes extinction, you haven't added very much value, right? Because you still have to win growth high, plan crushes growth, right? And to ultimately get to any of the growth impacts, right? So just having an external impact about growth and disease doesn't help you very much. In the instance we were talking about as well, arguably the other side could also claim to access disease, right? If they're getting to growth somehow as well. The next kind of misconception, I think, is that magnitude is the only relevant part of the impact. And, it is helpful to get to extinction, and I think, in the modern day, you should try to get to extinction or a very large magnitude with your impact. But that's not the only relevant part, right? So merely saying something is extinction doesn't mean you auto-win, right? You can win, that a disease that kills, 10,000, 20,000 people a year outweighs a nuclear war that kills everyone, if you've successfully demonstrated that there's a greater risk that the plan solves that relative to the DA internal link, presuming the app has some arguments mitigating the upper part of the internal link chain. The other thing I think that comes up a lot in relation to impacts is try or die. So try or die is merely introducing some tension between solvency and the impact, right? So the try there referring to, hey, any risk we solve should be sufficient because we have an impact. The impact is huge, and we're all certain to die because you can make limits to it, right? So this is useful to do, right? I think it's particularly useful when you have high magnitude impact and the link/solvency part of the argument is not as good, right? And you're relying on you need small risk. So like if you're debating an impact turn or something, and there's a sustainability debate happening, right? You typically want to say try or die on sustainability means we auto-win, particularly because the alternative or transition part of the impact turn debating is usually the weakest for the negative. To answer try or die, it is helpful again to have impact even still. It's not like you shouldn't answer the impact or even say try or die yourself if it's beneficial to you. But you should also remember again that non-unique arguments generally respond to try or die, right? Because they are a reason the status quo solves is a reason the status quo is trying to solve whatever harm that has been introduced, right? But outside of that, I think there are still a few reasons why try or die is silly, and why and how you should go about contesting it, right? The first is that the logic of try or die essentially means, right? So if the impact is 100, right, even if solvency is 0.01, you should still vote for the side that is introduced in the try or die argument. This essentially means that the mere introduction of an impact would guarantee you victory, right? I think most people would say a 1AC that contained 20 asteroid impacts cards and then an analytical solvency argument would not get it done, right? Because you need to introduce a claim that you solve the impact and not simply say, hey, this is an impact that is bad and will kill everyone. The second is that solvency does refute try or die, right? So even if you are in a situation where you don't have a lot of impact defense or a reason that we aren't certainly going to die, right? If the app has introduced the claim that, hey, there are 30 asteroids now, to avoid extinction, we need to take down at least 25 of them, right? And then the neg wins the argument that the app only stops 5 of them, right? Then that removes the try from try or die, because the app introduced an internal link to solving the die, right? That was 25 or whatever number I said of asteroids, right? If the negative successfully won that it won't, the app solvency does not reach that scope, then the affirmative is no longer trying. The last thing I would say about try or die and the reasons I don't think it's too great to read into it too much, and another thing I think you should say when debating teams that are going for try or die is that there is extreme uncertainty around inevitability, sustainability, and large impact predictions, right? That means that you should not automatically assume that we are certain to die, right? There are lots of things in the status quo that will inevitably kill lots of people, but that doesn't matter if you don't have a coherent solvency claim introduced for it, right? So you should evaluate things, again, relative risk rather than, okay, they introduced an impact, so any risk they solve the impact means auto vote. So I think the more productive way to think about internal link chains then is to think about it in link insolvency terms, right? So in other words, does the risk the plan solves the unique harms outweigh the risk it triggers, the DA link and causes a negative harm, right? And that would change, obviously, if there's like a counterpoint or something in the debate, but the reason link insolvency are the most important is because they are describing the direct effects, right? Direct consequences of the plan, right? They are what initiates the world ultimately, right? So you should always, I think, when, if you're about to give a 2 hour or 2 hour overview, right? The high level question you should ask yourself is not, why does nuclear war outweigh the environment, right? You should ask more so like, why does the risk the plan solves innovation by expanding some patent thing outweigh the risk the expansion of patents causes whatever the DD thing is, whether that be clog or, I don't know, I haven't done a ton of research on this topic, but, I think you get the idea. Okay, so the other, I think, common phrase or vocabulary that appears when I think comparing internal link chains, right, is turns case or turns DA, right? And that essentially means that whatever part of your internal link chain you've introduced, some part of it means that your opponent's internal link chain is now offense against them. So in the very simplest sense, right, if somebody is winning a turns case argument, right, the DA, right, so if you're depending on which side you are, right, DA is now an advantage, right, or the case is now a DA, right? So I think there's some misconceptions about turns case that I'll go through here in a second, but in general, when you hear that phrase get said, right, you should contest the premise that the case has truly been turned. Ask yourself, right, if I was to construct an internal link chain, right, against the AF or, against the status quo, depending on which side you're on, right, would what they've said as their turns case argument make sense, right? So is there a uniqueness link, internal link, and impact, right, that is uniquely caused by whatever the turns case argument is, right? So the most, I think, the worst form of turns case argument, and I think the one that's also, unfortunately, the most common, and probably wins a decent amount of debates, is the impact turns case, right? So in other words, the impact that our internal link chain gets to also gets to their impact, right? So take the example, right? So AF has a disease impact, right? The neg has a DA with a warming impact, right? And then the neg says warming causes disease, right? You have not turned the case in this instance, right? Your internal link chain just also now gets to a disease impact, right? Because warming causes disease. The other way to think about why this doesn't make sense, other than the fact that, again, have to win cumulative probability, is think about what the internal link to that impact is, right? So for the AF, right, if to get to disease, you're probably going to say, like, you can patent more, like, biotech stuff, right? Whatever that might be, right? So if that's the internal link to that stuff, right, and the uniqueness argument for why disease is coming now is that biotech innovation is declining, right, the neg's inroads to disease should somehow turn those internal links, right, or contain some uniqueness argument for why disease is being solved now, right? The internal link chain simply getting to disease is not sufficient to say you turned the case, right? And so in general, that's why I think the only like usual benefit, I think, of also saying that your impact gets to their impact is in the context of when impact framing arguments are made, right? So only X or only Y impact matters, or this is an S risk, whatever it may be, right? It's like for those types of claims, it's useful to say that you somehow also get to their impact, so they can't win on an impact framing argument. But even then, I still think like you should the easier thing to do and to win the debate is to mitigate the upper parts of the internal link chain, right? So impact turns case, even if it kind of theoretically makes sense, or there's a way to kind of make it turn the case, right? You ultimately have to win that your internal link chain is so quick, right, that it gets the impact before the AF's internal link chain takes place, right, because it's much slower, right? So maybe solvency, right, is much, much slower than the link to a DA, right? and you ultimately have to win a very high likelihood the internal link chain gets to the impact, right? To win that the impact turns their impact. And at that point, even if you win that, like, you should probably win anyway, right? Because you're winning because the internal link chain is quick, not because the impact turned the case or your impact got to their impact, right? So for that reason, I think impact turns case is usually not particularly relevant. And even, like, you shouldn't drop it, right? Because judges, have something that goes off when they hear turns case, right? Your opponents are obviously going to want to flag it, so make sure you still answer it, right? But you should understand, based on some of the reasons I gave you here, right, how you should go about contesting that, right? And that can be as simple as, hey, this is an impact turns case argument. That requires winning the cumulative probability of the internal links. So if we win no link and non-unique, that means that we have, successfully mitigated the internal link chain because the risk of getting to the impact is much lower. So as I mentioned before, right, all offensive arguments require uniqueness, right? So when you hear turns case or are trying to make a turns case argument, right, always think about what is the uniqueness argument, right, that is helping you get there and turn whatever the internal link chain is. So like in the prior example, like I mentioned, right, you would need a uniqueness argument for why there is some status quo mechanism containing warming that is also successfully containing disease to then say that that truly turns the case with warming causes disease. And usually that's like convoluted, and like if you've gotten to that point, you've probably already done something else to win the debate, and it's just a path of most resistance, I think. So the best and most logical turns case argument, I think, is link turns case, right? And that again is the same reason I said that we should focus on link insolvency when comparing internal link chain, right? Because they are the direct consequences of the plan, right? They're describing what the mechanism of the plan is directly resulting in, right? Now, oftentimes here, though, this is still not always turning the case, right? They're just often arguments that reduce the risk of app solvency, right? So, like, let's take the elections DA, for example, right? So, it's like Harris wins now, Trump, or doing some patent thing helps Trump win, and then Trump, is mean to NATO, and NATO solves an extinction, right? So that DA, right? So a common turns case argument made is that Trump will roll back the app, or he'll mess with app enforcement, right? And oftentimes, if this argument gets dropped, or someone just attaches the label turns case to it, I think for a lot of people it just means, oh, it's, the app is in trouble, right? Because this argument is, a reason that it turns the case apparently. But this is also often not the case, right? If you're saying that Trump rolls back the app or messes with app enforcement, that's not turning the case, that is defense, right? It's not a reason doing the plan causes the plan's harms, right? It's a reason that doing the plan could undermine solvency because of the president it ends up electing, right? The plan, right, does not currently exist, is not currently being enforced, right? For this uniqueness argument to make any sense, right, the plan would have to for the plan to cause its own harms, right, by the president, rolling it back or whatever, right, then the plan needs to currently exist, or there needs to be some uniqueness argument for why the harms that the app has introduced are being solved now, right, for the Trump rolls back or messes with app enforcement to ever matter, right? So that basically means, right, you need to win that Harris is certainly going to win now, and that she's going to do the plan, and if Trump gets elected, he'll roll back the plan. That would be a proper turns case argument, right? Now the advantage is a DA, right? Because you've successfully explained why the harms of the 1AC are going to be solved now, and why the plan, implementing the plan now instead of waiting for Harris to do it later on, right, will actually undermine the plan because it lets Trump get elected and roll back the app or mess with the app's enforcement or whatever it may be. I'm not gonna discourage you from using the phrase turns case or anything like that, right? I think it is still very powerful to many judges. Your opponents are also going to get scared by it, especially if the arguments are carded, right? So you should still be trying to turn the case or turn the DA or whatever. But what I think I'm saying is more important for is when your opponents say it against you and in instances where it's clearly not making any sense, right? So if you have the argument made against you, link turns case because Trump will mess with AF enforcement, right? Instead of thinking about that so much in terms of, oh, Trump won't roll back the AF or durable fiat solves, right? Those are things that, you should say, right? The other way the top level, high level way to think about it though is this argument is still defense, right? And you need to explain why the argument is defense, right? Based on kind of some of the explanation I just gave you, right? Because when you put that into the mind of a judge, right? Hey, they've just introduced the argument that winning the link undermines solvency, right? Then the judge is putting that argument in a very different category, right? It is not, oh, this is existential for the AF. If they drop it or don't deal with it correctly, it's 0, they lose, right? It's, oh, okay, the risk that Trump wins, right, and the risk that he is taking actions that undermine whatever the enforcement of the plan is, right, that reduces the scope of solvency, right, but doesn't automatically mean that the AF has lost or that their internal link chain is, suddenly 0 or, whatever it may be. So you want to have lots of judge instruction to walk through and kind of explain some of that stuff so you don't succumb to cases where the other side is asserting something has turned the case or turned the DA, but nothing has really happened because they're actually defensive arguments in disguise, or they're just the impact getting to the other impact, right? So you want to essentially kind of just lower the stakes of what that argument is, right? It's just because you said turns case does not mean you turned the case. Here's what turns case means. Here's what you would have to do to turn the case. Here are some other arguments that respond to that premise, right? One of those, arguments being that, if you win, that Trump is going to win now, for example, or winning the risk of that, right? That is cutting against this turns case argument, right? Because it would mean that it's inevitable because Trump is coming now, for example, right? Okay, so before I kind of open it up to some questions and discussion, the kind of last thing I'll say is a lot of this stuff can be confusing to navigate, right? Internal link chains are not always easy to deal with. So, I would encourage you to spend some time kind of putting these side by side and just kind of logically thinking through, okay, how are these things related and compared? And what parts of the chain would I want to mitigate to successfully explain why, an advantage outweighs a DA or something, right? So I'd encourage you to spend some time, thinking about some of these things, right? Not all of it will come to you immediately. And the other big thing I would encourage you to do is when you are in debates and debating, explain these things in simple terms. Just say, hey, a turns case argument requires uniqueness. So if you say warming causes disease, you need to win a uniqueness argument about why global warming is being, or why disease is being solved now, right? You can just really make it basic like that and explain it, right? It can also just be as basic as, hey, most of the 2NR was just impact calculus and impact turns case arguments. All of that requires they win the link and uniqueness arguments, and we are going to beat them with that. So not having impact defense or answering the impact in great detail is not relevant, right? So think about how you can explain to the judge some of the things that we've discussed here, right? So then the debate can be much easier to resolve, right? And some of these misconceptions don't result in you. Okay, with that, we have 15 minutes here, and I'll open up some questions and discussion. Yeah.
You throw an example of making an effective turns case argument and what that would look like.
Sure. So let's take the economy aside last year, right? So assuming Ned says is making an argument about interest rates, AF is making an argument about slow growth, right? So the way you would want to go about turning the case ideally, right, is to say that the AF causes all the bad things it claims it solves about the economy, right? So to effectively make a turns case argument, right, the first thing is you need a uniqueness argument. You need uniqueness arguments on the economy is fine now, right? And that's not just there is no rate hike coming now or no inflation coming now, right? You also need to answer the AF's uniqueness arguments about the economy, right? So you need to say, no slow growth or secular stagnation now, no demand side crisis, unemployment low, all the various structural claims the AF is making about the economy in that instance, right? You need to introduce uniqueness arguments to contest these. And not all of these will necessarily be on the DA, right? You might end up doing it on the case, right? And you can just reference the case when making the argument, right? So you need uniqueness arguments to mitigate that. And then you want to explain why your links mess with all of the aft. So obviously, like, link gets to the economy somehow, but you ideally want to get to an explanation of why the plan causing a rate hike means that it also causes slow growth, right? It also causes inequality, right? So, for example, right, if AF's primary story about the economy is about inequality, right? In addition, so provided you have, inequality low cards on the case, right? Then you can now read link arguments to turn inequality by saying inflation increases inequality, right? Because the most marginalized are the most impacted by higher prices, right? So essentially, that's a way of saying, think about, right, how does your link get to or cause, right, the AF's harms, right? And what is the uniqueness argument you need to win to make that offense? Other questions? You can also open up to more general questions if people just have general things they're thinking about. Yeah.
What do you think the best way to articulate a form of the entire dialogue is?
The best way to articulate try or die? Well, I think you have to articulate, right, that the impact is the most important, right? Nothing matters if we're all dead, right? You need to live to fight another day to be able to do anything, right? Because they have not right? You want to make clear, hey, they have not made a uniqueness or impact defense argument, right? So because of this, you are certain to die, right? And that is ultimately all that matters. And you should say that precedes solvency because, there's the way you want to word solvency as being secondary, right? We have some risk of a link, we have some risk of solvency, right? We have some risk, so if you heard impact turn, right, some risk the alt solves or the transition will be successful or something like that. You always want to say impact matters before everything, give some explanation on why live to fight another day is good, right? And then you want to explain why solvency is secondary, need just some risk. And in general, I think it's rare that solvency arguments are so bad that they're irrelevant, that they just become irrelevant. The only I think the instances where it's most common, where try or die is very silly because of how infinitesimally small the risk of the try solving is typically when, again, you're effectively debating against an impact turn or critique with a sustainability argument, right? And you said, hey, look, they have just introduced uniqueness and impact cards. There is little to no solvency there's little to no evidence or clear explanation tying all these things together, right? And so because of that, right, you should treat the impact as secondary. Also keep in mind that you have uncertainty about, whether you're going to die, right? So that's where I think that's where typically, right, you need to kind of overemphasize try or die or the impact because solvency is much weaker. Yeah.
I feel like try or die is different on the app and the neg. So if you're answering it this that and you can see uniqueness and impact, you can still get out of try or die by answering the link. But if the neg concedes uniqueness and the impact for an affirmative, then if they don't have a way to solve the impact or solve, then the app can say and this the sufficient to affirm this in the status quo, the extinction happens in everything.
Yeah, so I think exactly. So what you're describing there is, right, try or die is usually more of an AF thing because in most cases the AF is the one that is trying, right? The neg, right, if it's just going for a DA, right, is defending the status quo. And you can say the status quo is you can still contest that premise by saying the status quo is trying, right? But in general, right, we think about try in terms of an advocacy or an actual policy change, right? So that's why the AF can more effectively utilize try or die, right? So this year, right, so terminal uniqueness claims or impact claims about declining innovation and why that implicates other parts of the DA, right, are useful for setting up a try or die argument on the AF. The neg, right, usually needs a counter plan to either contest try or die by saying, hey, we have a counter plan, so we're also trying, so some risk counterplan solves versus some risk app solves should be treated as negligible. Try or die is not as relevant if we also have a counterplan that arguably solves as well or near as well as the case, right? And that's also why, for critiques, right? That's why things like CAP can effectively introduce sustainability arguments about try or die, right? Because you introduce an alternative that is proposing, some, not a prescriptive change per se, but like some change to the status quo relative to whatever they've described their, framework argument as. So yes, try or die typically is more apt because the app is usually the one doing the trying, right? But when the neg introduces counterplans or has an advocacy that can implicate that, and effective negative debating can also explain why even when defending the status quo, there's still a try happening. Yeah. Yeah, so I think there's a couple instances that I think, or types of uniqueness debating. One is when just one side is completely in the wrong direction, right? And when that exists, you want to make it yes, no, right? So it's the most basic instance for this comment is just when the neg is trying really hard to make up a politics scenario when it clearly does not exist that week, right? So in those kinds of instances, right, you want the uniqueness to just be look, this is completely in the opposite direction. They have no evidence that asserts this is going to pass. We are the only ones with conclusive, definitive evidence in one direction that establishes a descriptive or predictive claim. That is the threshold for a uniqueness argument. So the DA is functionally zero because they have not introduced evidence, right? It's kind of what I was talking about before, right? Where it's there are many instances where one side just is missing a part of the internal link chain. Now, with made up politics thing, you'll probably have a uniqueness card, but it's it's the equivalent of an analytic or not having a card at all because it's generally so bad, right? So in those instances when you're debating uniqueness, you want to think about it in terms of direction of uniqueness, and we want to win direction of uniqueness and use that to mess with everything. Now, the other instances, right, where there's uniqueness in which both sides have, competing uniqueness arguments that both make sense, right? So parts of last year, right, with the interest rates DA, there were, good cards going in both directions for no rate hike now, yes rate hike now, right? In those instances, right, I would say the first thing you want to do is, if you're neg, right, or I guess both sides, you want to try and figure out a uniqueness argument that is kind of external in a way to that, right? That implicates and can resolve the contestation between, hey, is Fed going to do a rate hike now, right? So if you were AF last year, right, you would have wanted to say, hey, we have these other arguments about why, other uniqueness arguments about why growth and stuff is going to decline, so you should treat that as, preceding evaluation of whether or not the Fed is going to cut a rate hike now, because structural long-term claims about the economy are what matters, right? The negative, on the other hand, right, can try to work around it by saying that there's still uniqueness for their DA for some other reason, right? So, example, right, is if you have the interest rates DA with a dollar hedge impact, right, the negative could try to, push aside the whole debate, the whole, central part of the uniqueness debate altogether by just saying, hey, look, our impact is dollar hedge. For them to not need the DA, they have to win dollar hedge dead now, right? Even if you're uncertain about, whether existing rate hikes or potentially future rate hikes can, harm the economy or whatever, right? It's for a fact that the United States is the dollar hegemon now, and that is sufficient for us to win uniqueness for the DA, right? So you want to try and make differentiators that make the central parts of the debating kind of irrelevant in case that one side is doing better than the other. The final thing, though, then is just solid evidence comparison, right? What things is your EV considering that their EV isn't, right? Is your EV more recent? Is it more conclusive and better phrased? Is there a greater diversity of warrants? And trying to pick through, okay, which of these, what parts of our evidence set is the strongest, right? And what do we want to flag the most when comparing things to, your evidence to their evidence, right? And you also want to include some indicts of their evidence and reasons that, they're wrong about whatever the things that that they've said and why, also considering, right, what are the good things in, the other side's evidence and why are the reasons our evidence is preferable, why are those reasons we've given more important than the reasons the neg evidence would be good. Yeah.
Also, like, just thought about this, like, I don't think that people do this often, but I have, like, remember it happened before, like, if the 2AR against it decided just that it's non-unique, does not mean that the neg basically, like, kind of automatically wins, because if that, in the world of the app, like, the impacts of the stat happen, like, if they concede everything else and just go for non-unique, that any risk that the stat is unique, like, is sufficient to negate.
Yeah, the other way I would think about that is like, if the link is completely conceded, right, and the link argument is establishing a clear differential between the status quo and the plan, right, even if the app's non-unique arguments push back against some of the DA, it's like, there is if link is 100, right, it just needs some sufficient uniqueness, right, to be able to say the plan is uniquely worse than the status quo, right? So yeah, the thing I think that you're getting at more there, that I also discussed a little bit earlier, right, is if you're not contesting multiple parts of the internal link chain, then it's going to be really difficult to win the debate, both because you have less ink on the flow generally, right, and because what was I saying? It's hard to win because of that, and because if you haven't contested other parts of the internal link chain, if one side has explained why not answering those parts of the internal link chain implicates your internal link chain, right, there's very little pushback you're going to be able to have, right? So if you have, link turns case, for example, right, and you are relying entirely on non-unique, right, if you don't successfully win extremely, extremely high risk that DA is non-unique, right, then you're going to be in huge trouble if neg is successfully winning link turns case, right? Similarly, right, if the neg has solid impact framing, right, and you're not contesting the impact or making impact defense, right, that can help one side more. So you should always be trying to contest multiple parts of the internal link chain, and then explaining why those are more important, right, than the parts of the internal link chain that you may not have chosen to contest, right? And generally speaking, right, having multiple cuts means that all the tricks that one side can try to do are much harder, right? So if you have, non-unique and no internal link, right, that can be effective in ensuring that the non-unique can help you with dealing with link turns case, right, and no internal link can help you contest, hey, impact is huge, because you've mitigated an upper part of the internal link chain, right? So always be thinking, right, what are the 2 or 3 cuts that we think are the best arguments to make about the internal link chain? Don't always try to put all your eggs in one basket, because that means that the other side now generally has one argument to beat. Now, I mean, there are effective two ARs that can be given on one argument entirely, and that's often the case when it's just like, okay, either we have literally nothing else to say about this, or it's because this genuinely is the correct argument against this position, right? And it's much better for us to explain this argument in detail for 3 or 4 minutes, and explaining every card we read, comparing it to the cards they read, rather than, extending 5 arguments that are all not very good and aren't going to get you very, very far. Okay, it's 9:49. Do we have any last minute questions? Okay, cool, sounds good.